screen. Sorry.
So just the arrows should work for you now.
Awesome. All right, we're live. So as we get started, I just want to say a shout out, a Shabbat Shalom to Beth Melekh, New York, to Baruch and Kerry Hutkins. I just want to say Shabbat Shalom and thank you for joining us online, and whoever is with you and your mishpacha, so welcome. And everyone else online who is watching, welcome, and thanks for joining us. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Can I just start by saying it's wonderful to see some of my favourite faces in this room and that are joining us. It's so nice to be in good company tonight in the shul with all of you, and I'm really excited. About what I have to share tonight, and I hope that you guys glean something from this, take something away or edified or built up from what I'm going to share tonight. And I mean, just I guess a basic roadmap of what I want to major on tonight is I really want to encourage us to grow in our love and our passion for the scriptures. And you know, I sympathize with people who, you know, sometimes say that it may be a bit of a struggle to read certain things, and some things are just hard to grasp and understand. And I think for some of us, we need a bit of a starting point, a bit of a reference point. And so tonight I want to major on what I've called, my message is called the Jewish Advantage. And where that comes from is from this passage in Romans, Romans chapter 3. And this passage talks about this advantage that was given to the Jewish people that actually we can all have and catch up to. If we're willing to be humble and if we're willing to be teachable, we too can have that same advantage. And so tonight what I'm going to really do is look at some of the idioms that Yeshua uses in the Gospels, and I'm going to take 3 idioms, and I'm just going to unpack them and show you how they would have been easily grasped and understood by Yeshua's first century Jewish listeners. And the reason it was really, we can assume they understood them, is because they're direct quotes from Jewish history that had shaped the religious and cultural context of those Jews living in the first century. So he uses very familiar idioms to tell parables, to unpack points, to reveal the kingdom of God. And so for us, the challenge is we need to catch up to what would have easily been understood by Yeshua's first century Jewish listeners. And we can do that by sometimes taking off our 21st century Gentile lenses and putting on first century Jewish lenses to read the text that's in front of us. And then we would be better equipped to apply it to here and now in our walks. So that's really what I'm going to major on. I'm going to look at some idioms, going to unpack them, and hopefully stimulate some excitement and some understanding from some of these idioms that Yeshua used. So if we just go to slide 1. So just on that, if you guys were here the last time when I was able to share, I majored on this message called 2 or 3 Witnesses. And what I got to with that message is to encourage us to be discerning. And one of the most used or referred to principles in the scriptures is this principle or instruction around every matter or fact is established on the reliability of 2 or 3 witnesses. So it's used all throughout Scripture. And the two most reliable witnesses that we need to rely on in our faith for us as believers to continue to walk on in Yeshua, towards Yeshua, to life perpetual, is the witness of the Spirit of God within us. So that's the Spirit of God, the Spirit of truth that dwells in us, that guides us, that helps us to understand and deal with reality, to deal and understand with the words of Yeshua. And then the other witness is the witness of the Scriptures. So we need to rely on both witnesses. And I really love the parable of the narrow way and the narrow gate and the wide gate, because the narrow gate, it's actually it's been narrowed on purpose, gate is the one that leads to life and life abundant. And in order to walk that road, i.e. stay in the middle of the road, we need to be able to discern truth, and we need both witnesses to stay on the straight and narrow, as it were. We need the witness of the Spirit of God in us, bearing witness to truth, and we need the witness of the Scriptures. And so tonight I want to major on the witness of the Scriptures. And so this message is called The Jewish Advantage. So I've spoken about that. So one of the things in regards to understanding the Scriptures that I just wanted to start off with is, for myself personally, I'm no scholar. I'm no expert. I don't have any PhDs or THDs. I quite gladly refer to myself as a common person, as it were. And for me, I really love and identify with Yeshua's earliest disciples, because by and large, they were common people, weren't they? They weren't the elite, they weren't the educated, they weren't the scholarly, they were the common people, the everyday working family men, as it were, that he chose to follow after him. And I really love that. I really love how Yeshua chose them, because I can identify with them. I can identify with these kind of, everyday, average kind of blokes that followed after Yeshua, and whom he chose. And so for me, it's not that I am or God is opposed to the educated. Paul was very educated, and he ended up scribing half the New Testament. So it's not that God is opposed to the educated, but that's not the qualifier to help us to dig deeper and to understand the Scriptures. In fact, as a side note, if you look back in the first century when Yeshua came on the scene, many of the scholars and the experts in his day initially actually completely missed him. You think about that. You think about some of the religious leaders in Yeshua's day. They were the language experts, they were the scholars, they were the academics, essentially. And a lot of them initially, they missed Yochanan, they missed John's immersion or baptism of repentance, and it was the common people, the sinners, those who came to the realization that we need repentance, we need to humble ourselves. And it was them that recognized Yeshua. It was the common people, it was the sinners, it was those that weren't the so-called scholarly or the experts. That's not to say that some of those experts and scholars eventually did not come to faith in him, but initially they missed it. And Paul talks about that. Initially, when he encountered Yeshua, he had to actually withdraw from all the clamor of the day. Paul was a scholar, Paul was an expert, he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee of Pharisees. But he writes in the letter to the Galatians, he says, initially I did not consult flesh and blood. When he had his initial revelation, he said, I did not initially consult flesh and blood, but I withdrew to Arabia. Paul actually had to withdraw from the clamor of the day to actually think things through for himself. And I really love that, because I think in this day and age, in this time, we live in the age of information overload and misinformation overload. And so I think that practice, that discipline, there are times when I think when we're trying to discern the will of God for our lives, in our lives, for our families, when we're making big decisions, I think it can be a good practice for a time just to withdraw to discern what God might be saying, what God might be doing. And so, I just wanted to make that point that, we don't have to be highly educated or have these esoteric experiences or be super spiritual, that the Scriptures are for all of us who have the Spirit of God in us and who are willing to catch up to what those early listeners easily understood because of the cultural and religious context of first century Judaism. Okay. So I've started off with this quote, and this is from Paul's letter to the Romans, and I've just quoted the first half of this verse. And I really love this verse because it talks about this advantage that that the Jewish people had, and that we can also have too if we're willing to catch up to what they would have easily known. So this verse starts off like this, and it says, this is Paul saying, "Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision?" And he goes on to say, "Great." And this Greek word, I think it's translated or transliterated into English as mega or megos or something. And actually part of it means a superabundance. So this word that's used in this text, it's not just, this is great, or it's all right. It's actually the advantage that's given is a superabundance or an abundant supply. So that's, I think that's really cool. And he says, so it's great, it's a superabundance in every respect. So if we go to slide 2. So what is the superabundance or this abundance supply that is an advantage to being Jewish or to the benefit of circumcision? So I've just got a couple of rhetorical questions up there around, so what is this advantage? And so that first question says, is the advantage that was given to the Jewish people, is it because of our great strength, our great resource, our great empire? And I've got a couple of scriptures here that actually kind of answer these questions. So is it because of our great strength as a people? And in Deuteronomy 7, verse 7 to 8, it says this: "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people of his own special treasure, out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." Now listen to this. "The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples. You were the fewest of all the peoples." So God chose us specifically because we were the fewest. We were few in number. So for you were the fewest of all the people. But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers. The Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So he didn't choose us because of our great strength as a people, our great resource. Actually, the opposite was true. We were enslaved in Egypt. You can't get much lower on the pecking order of society, being enslaved to the biggest empire of the day. So it wasn't because of our great strength. It was actually because we were the fewest, and he was keeping his oath that he had swore to our ancestors. So if that's not our great advantage, is our great advantage our intellect? Jews are overrepresented in Nobel Prizes for art and literature, but is that the reason why God chose us? Are we super smart? And then I've got this scripture which is found in Matthew. This is Matthew 11. And I really love this scripture because it's a good reminder to us about the faith that we're supposed to have in regards to seeing the things of God. So this is Matthew 11, verse 25 to 26, and it says this: "At that time Yeshua said, 'I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent, and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, this was well-pleasing in your sight.'" So intellect, intelligence is not a qualifier as to what gives us our advantage, even though we do have good representation in that area. It's actually to share babes, to us who have childlike faith, that God reveals these things to. And so that last question there I've got, is it simply because of our ethnicity? Does that give us this advantage? And I really love this passage from Isaiah that talks about who God looks upon. So this is Isaiah 66, verse 1 to 2, and it says this: "Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where then is a house you could build for me, and where is a place that I may rest? For my hand made all these things, thus all these things came into being, declares the Lord. But to this one I will look, to him who is humble and contrite of spirit, and who trembles at my word." So it's for none of those things that God had chose us as a people. And actually the second half of this verse, or verse 2 in Romans, the 3rd chapter, actually says why he had chose us and what the advantages been given to us. And it says this: it says, first of all, that they, the Jewish people, were entrusted with the oracles, utterances, words, essence, instructions of God. So what is the Jewish advantage? It is 1,000 years of previous history before the inception of the gospel, which went out to all the nations. So that means something. That actually means something. 1,000 years of history, as it is recorded in the scriptures, with our ancestors. The words, the utterances, the instructions, the heroes of the scriptures, the audio visuals, the rituals, the temple service, everything. That's our advantage. We had first access to those things. It's not because we are more valuable or highly valued above other peoples. It's because it's the order by which God chose to reveal his redemptive plan to all of humanity. God chose an able and willing couple, Abraham and Sarah, and their mission was to have a family. Their calling was to have a family. And God said, it's unto you and your descendant and descendants after them that I will bless the entire earth. So it's not this superiority of simply being an ethnic group. It's the order by which God chose to reveal himself by the gospel to all of humanity. And so it's an order. And so this advantage, this 1,000 years of history before Yeshua comes on the scene, that's the advantage. That's the advantage we can catch up to by simply catching up to what would have easily been understood in the first century because of our history. It's because of our history as it's recorded in the scriptures. So what I wanted to do for the rest of the night is I'm going to take 3 idioms that Yeshua quotes or uses, and what I want to do is I'm going to unpack them and show you that actually we don't have to look far to realize some of these images and some of these idioms, they're there for us in the scriptures to explore and understand. That a lot of strange sayings and imagery that Yeshua uses in some of his parables and some of his sayings, at first glance to us we might think, oh, that's strange. Why did he say it that way? Or why did he use that imagery? And a lot of it would have been very familiar to his audience. So if we go to the next slide. Okay. So this is the first idiom one I want to unpack, and this is quite a cool one. I'm quite excited by this one. And this is the idiom of an evil eye. So it sounds a little bit spooky, but it's all good. Relax, it's fine. And it's this phrase or this term that Yeshua uses in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 to 24. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the passage in its context, and then I'm going to show you that actually in some of these passages, in all of these passages, Yeshua is directly quoting from the Tanakh, or from what Christians call the Old Testament. And that's what gives it its context. That's the metaphor, that's how we understand it. So it's not that hard, but it just takes a simple understanding of a bit of Jewish history. Okay, I'm going to go through and read this text. Okay, so this is from Matthew 6, and it reads this. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now this is where it gets interesting. So the eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. So the light that is in you is darkness. How great is the darkness! No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth or mammon. So it's probably a very familiar passage to all of you guys, and some of it's pretty self-explanatory with treasures in heaven and storing up treasures in heaven and not on earth. But there's this interesting phrase in there that we can easily skim over, or that we can completely ignore because it just seems strange. And it's this term, if your eye is evil, or an evil eye. And it almost seems a little bit like, why would he say that, or why does he say it like that? Anyone ever thought that? Anyone ever wondered why Yeshua said, if your eye is bad or your eye is evil? I know in some English translations they say if your eye is bad, but actually the literal translation says if your eye is evil. And the reason why that's a good English translation is because it's actually a direct quote. So if we go to the next slide. Conflict. next slide. Thanks. Okay, so we've got this term that's used in this passage where it talks about, storing up for yourselves. Don't trust in earthly or material things solely, but store for yourself treasures in the heavens. And then it goes on to use this term, if your eye is evil, then your whole body will be. So what is this term, an evil eye? And actually, what does it have to do with the serving of wealth and mammon over God? It's kind of a bit strange and a bit out of character. And here's the question we should constantly ask ourselves when we approach the text. And the question is this: what would Yeshua's first century Jewish listeners have understood? So he's speaking to them and he expects them to understand the phraseology that he's using. So what would they have understood? And we need to see it through their eyes. And actually, they would have understood a lot because it's actually a direct quote from the Proverbs. It's actually spoken really clearly of in the Proverbs. And when we apply it to Yeshua's, monologue there, it makes perfect sense. And so I'm going to take you to this proverb. So if we go to the next slide. So this is one of the places in the Proverbs where this term or this phrase is quoted from. And you'll hear some of the familiar themes similar to what Yeshua says about wealth and serving it. And so I'll read this text to you. So Proverbs 23, verse 4 to 8, and it says this: do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. When you set your eye on it, it is gone. For wealth certainly makes itself wings like an eagle that flies toward the heavens. Now pay attention to this. Do not eat the bread of an evil eye. So the Hebrew literally reads, if you were to translate the Hebrew literally into English, it literally says, do not eat the bread of an evil eye. A lot of English translations will translate it, I've got it there in brackets, a selfish person. So the NASB, which is probably the go-to English translation I use, it translates that a selfish person. But actually, the King James, and yay, power to the King James, in this instance does a good job because I looked it up and it translates the scripture as evil eye. So if you've got a King James, it probably says evil eye, which is the right translation. So it says, do not eat the bread of an evil eye, or it's inferring a selfish person, or desire his delicacies. For as he thinks within himself, so he is. He says to you, eat and drink, but his heart is not with you. You will vomit up the morsel you have eaten and waste your compliments. So can you see some of the correlation there with what Yeshua is saying? Yeshua's, and to his audience, he's talking about the importance of not trusting in material, earthly wealth solely. So Yeshua's talking about that, and he encourages his audience. He says, don't trust in those things, but store up for yourself treasures in heavens, i.e. value the things that God values. That's what's more important. And then he goes on to say, you cannot serve God and mammon. It means you can't serve God above wealth. It doesn't mean we hate wealth. We all, there's joy in our work. We look at this on every Shabbat, we remember that God provides for our work. So there's this joy in cultivating and eating the fruit of our labor. But we constantly need to soberly assess, are we solely pursuing the things of wealth, of material wealth? And if we're being completely honest, in the Western world, that's probably our number one idol, isn't it? Is wealth, is mammon, is the accumulation of material wealth more than we need. But you can see the correlations here, and you can see that I actually really love this parable because, I don't know, can we have a show of hands? Does anyone know anyone, or has anyone worked for anyone, or has a family member where you kind of say, like, man, that person is as tight as, bro, like, that guy won't spend money on anything. Anyone know anyone like that? Like, there's a lot of hands going up in the room. So you guys ever been around someone like that, and it's like uncomfortable, eh? Like you're around someone and you can't like just eat and feast and just, I'm a growing boy, so I like to eat, but I've been around, like, I remember one time this was a few years ago, I was with one of the owners of the business I worked for, and it was so weird, we had to go on this trip and he had to like shout me dinner. And I almost could feel the eyes like looking through my head, watching everything I ate at the dinner table. It's like he had to buy me dinner, but his heart wasn't with me. You guys ever been around that? So I love this text because it's actually a real practical sense. It talks about don't be that person. Don't have an evil eye where you're selfish, you're self-serving, and really you don't want to share with others. You don't want to, share the things that you have with others, eat and drink and all the wonderful things. Don't be that person. Don't be selfish. Don't have an evil eye that's solely focused on that. So if we go to the next slide, and I've just got another quote from further on in the Proverbs, and it says this quite plainly actually. It refers to it again, and it says very plainly, it says, a man with an evil eye hastens after wealth, or pursues the things of wealth as the ultimate thing that they value or kind of worship, because the ultimate thing we value is ultimately what we put our heart on, what we worship, isn't it? So it says, a man with an evil eye hastens after wealth and does not know that want will come upon him. So they'll never be satisfied. So if we go to the next slide. So when Yeshua is speaking about this, I really love how this kind of helps us to understand, or gives us another layer or an extra understanding as to what Yeshua was really trying to emphasize with his audience and what would have been really familiar with them. And I've got this here as a summary of this conclusion of the idiom of an evil eye. Yeshua uses the Jewish idiom of an evil eye in the Gospels to remind his Jewish listeners of the fallacy in only storing up and solely trusting in material treasures here on earth. As always, Yeshua cuts to the heart of the issue, which is addressing our evil tilt to be selfish and greedy. So whether we like to believe it or not, we do have this tilt in our carnality to tilt towards being self-serving and being greedy. Thankfully, Yeshua gives us the antidote to our evil eye, that with his empowerment, we can store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, i.e. aligning and walking in the things that God himself values and treasures. So the antidote to our tilt to being greedy or self-serving is to not trust in those treasures, material things here on earth, but to store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, i.e. value the things that God values. And for me personally, the first thing that comes to mind, what does God value? Ultimately, God values people, doesn't he? He values, he puts, for me personally and for many of us, within our sphere, our family, as the priority of those that we should value and love and care for. And then in our wider community, the Lord brings different people into our world to value them and to care for them. And so I love the antidote to this not being greedy and selfish is to be generous with our time, to love and care for those in our world. And so value the things that God values, which helps to deal with this tilt towards being selfish and greedy. So that's one idiom. So if we go on to the next slide. So I want to go on to another really interesting term that Yeshua uses, another Jewish idiom that I think is a really cool one, and that would have once again been easily understood by his first century Jewish listeners. So you guys would be familiar with this text, and I'm just going to read it to you and just give it a bit of context, and then we're going to unpack it again. Just catch up to my notes. Okay. So I'll just read through these few verses, and then I'll give it a bit of context, and then we'll try and unpack and see what Yeshua meant by these words. So this is from Matthew chapter 18, verse 18 to 20, and it reads this: Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosened in heaven. Again I say to you, that if two of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where two or three have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. So this is from obviously Matthew 18, and just leading up to these few verses, in which I'm going to focus on the term of binding and loosening. Just to give it a bit of context, it's leading up to it, it's Yeshua giving the instruction around how we should deal with someone who's sinned against us. So if there's an offence and someone has sinned against us, if you guys are familiar with the passage, we are to go to that person in private, and we are to deal with them in private and bear witness to them. So there's that term, bear witness again. So we're to bear witness, to persuade, to influence, and to show them the error of their way, their fallacy. But we are to be a witness. And if they continue to reject us, there's a process we go through. So there's a process. And then it's interesting that once he goes through that, and it comes to these verses in it, and once again, it almost seems like this phraseology is just, it's kind of weird and it's kind of just thrown in there and it kind of doesn't make sense. And it's this term of binding and loosening. And I don't know about you guys, but I've heard some weird stuff come from different people around what they think this means. And I remember hearing from, I guess, different people in different Christian circles that we're literally supposed to bind and loosen stuff in the spiritual world. And I guess it made sense to me at the time, but I guess as I thought about it deeper and deeper, I thought it kind of is out of context with the whole passage and everything that's being said there. And so what I want to do is I want to actually unpack it and show you what Yeshua, or the term would have been really familiar to Yeshua's audience. So if we flick to the next slide. So binding and loosening, and I've got here, so what does that have to do with heaven and earth? Because it goes on to say heaven and earth and the Father. And then once again, the question we need to ask ourselves, as always, is what would Yeshua's first century Jewish listeners have understood about this term? And once again, they would have understood a lot. Because it's actually an ancient rabbinical idiom used in the Proverbs again and in the Torah. So you guys, hopefully this is starting to sound a bit familiar, but if not, we'll flick across to the text where this is actually used, and it gives us a bit of context, or gives us the context for what this ancient Jewish idiom meant. So this is from Proverbs chapter 6, and this is verse 20 to 23, and this is one of the passages where it's used, and I think it's wonderful actually. So it reads this: My son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Is Trey here? Trey needs to listen to this. Anyone seen Trey? Okay. So I'll say that again. My son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. And it goes on to say this: bind them continually to your heart, and tie them around your neck. When you walk about, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk to you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light. And reproofs for discipline are the way of life. So this wonderful passage talks about, if we've been fortunate enough to have godly parents, and all our parents are mixed bags, but the godly things that our parents have advised us, it says in this passage wonderfully that we are to observe them. But it uses this phrase, doesn't it? It says, bind them continually to your heart. So, we can take that literally, and I don't know how you'd write down everything your parents said and how it would penetrate to your heart. But of course, it's a metaphor, it's an idiom being used, isn't it? That to the core of our being, to the innermost, deepest part, where we keep everything that's precious and dear to us, we are to keep the wisdom and instruction of our mum and dad, aren't we? If they were godly, if they gave us good advice, good direction, good guidance, we are to take what they have said and keep it at our inner being. And not only the things that they've instructed us to do, but they would have given us boundaries of things to stay away from, to things to keep from, of things not to do. So all those things we're supposed to keep at the core of our being. And then the very next line it says, tie them around your neck. Now once again, we can't literally do that, write down everything our parents have said and tie it. Well, we could do that, but you'd look a bit silly. But once again, there's another Jewish metaphor there that's been used around the neck. You would have heard the phrase when we rebelled against God, this phrase was used that you're a stiff-necked people, unwilling to yield and unwilling to be directed and humble under the instruction and yoke of God that he wanted to place on our neck to direct us. So taking the instruction of our parents, it's being humble enough to take on their yoke and be directed by it, to take their instructions, their godly instructions, and be humble enough to apply them and remember them. So we see this phrase binding being used, and we see it being used in a really beautiful way in this proverb, isn't it? Then again to the next slide, it's used again in this proverb in a very similar way. It says this again, it says, my son, keep my words and treasure my commandments within you. Keep my commandments and live, and my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers and write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your intimate friend, that they may keep you from the adulteress and from the foreigner who flatters with her words. So once again, we see this term of binding in the context of a father lovingly giving instruction to his son. And he says to treasure them within you and keep my commandments. And I love this picture being given to us. It says, keep the teaching as the apple of your eye. You know, the pupil of your eye, meaning that the teaching, the commandment, it's supposed to be in your face, intimate, face to face, in your eyes, seen. And it says this, it's kind of funny, it says, bind them to your fingers. And once again, we can't write down everything up here and see it and literally bind them to our fingers. But if we were to understand the idiom, it's, you know, the fingers are an extension of the hand, and our hands is what we use to work. You know, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your strength. So whatever we put our hand to, you know, the wonderful, godly, wise instructions that our parents have given us, we should recall it. When we're putting our hand to work, we should recall some of the things that our parents have given us by binding them to our fingers or to our hands and writing them once again on the tablet of your heart. And then it goes on to say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your intimate friend, that they may keep you from the adulteress. So quite literally in the context of the context of a father instructing his son, he's giving him boundaries and he's saying, don't go near it, stay away from it. You know, discipline is this word that's kind of got a bad rap these days. It kind of comes with all this baggage, where discipline's often associated with impugning someone else or punishing someone else. But actually godly discipline is to prevent going off the rails, to prevent crossing the boundaries where hurt and harm can happen. And in the context of this is exactly what's being said. He's saying, don't go near it. Don't go near it. That's godly discipline and godly instruction, isn't it? That we're supposed to bind to our fingers and take to our heart. So if we flick to the next slide, and I'll just sum this up. So this term of binding and loosening. So Yeshua uses an ancient Jewish idiom of bind and loosen to illustrate to his Jewish listeners how we are to seek the will of God himself and our work here on the planet. We are to bind, that is to forbid, what is already bound in heaven. And we are to loosen, allow what is already decided in heaven. So in the context of that passage in Matthew 18, it says, when 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, why do we gather? We gather because we're seeking the will of God. You know, when I talked about we're supposed to find 2 or 3 reliable witnesses that are supposed to testify to the things that God is trying to tell us. That's why we gather, isn't it? That's why we gather with other believers, because we're seeking the will of God. And we seek the will of God because we're trying to discern what he's already decided. We don't decide what to do and what not to do. We're called to discern it. So we discern what's already allowed in heaven, and we outwork it here on the planet. And then we look for what is not allowed, what God has told us not to go near or instructed us to stay away from, and we do it here on the planet. So I've got here, we don't decide the will of God, we discern it and we live it out. So that's why 2 or 3 gather, isn't it? To seek the will of the Father and to apply it, to walk it out and to live it out here on the planet. And what I have, so that last part of Matthew 18, it says, we can discern the will of God when 2 or 3 reliable witnesses are gathered in his name, seeking his will and not our own. So we're to discern the will of God. So binding is, bind can either is to forbid or to instruct or to keep away from. So we're supposed to understand what God's instructed us to stay away from or given us boundaries around, and then we're supposed to outwork it here on the planet. And to loosen is what has God allowed, what has God allowed us to walk in, and then we're supposed to apply it and walk it out here on the planet. So this term of binding and loosening is to actually do and not do. It's really that simple. And if we think about the most famous, I guess, the central prayer to Judaism, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, the central prayer to Judaism, it goes on to say, you shall take these instructions and you shall bind them to your hand. You shall bind them to the doorposts of your house. You shall bind them to your heart. It's essentially saying, these instructions that I'm giving you today, walk in them, live them out, talk about them, apply them in everything you do. Isn't that beautiful? So it's a wonderful metaphor, and it's wonderful when we learn about it and we can apply what Yeshua is saying. Okay, so we'll go on to the third idiom. So this is quite a cool one, and it's quite an interesting one. So this third Jewish idiom that I wanted to unpack with you guys is this idiom about gates. And yeah, I'll just catch up with my notes. Okay, so this term, and it's really the gates of Hades. It's quite an interesting term that Yeshua uses, and it's actually quite interesting if you guys don't know it. This is where we, this is no knock to my Catholic friends, but this is where we get that picture of Peter and the pearly gates. You guys ever heard of that and kind of laugh about it, and it's pretty well known. It actually comes wrongly, is drawn from this passage about Peter, I guess in the Catholic tradition, being the first pope, and Peter and the pearly gates, and we see all these pictures and this kind of, we have this laugh about it. But that's not what's being said here, just for clarity. But I want to unpack actually what was Yeshua saying that day, and what was he declaring, and what are we supposed to draw and understand from that. So I'll read this passage and I'll give it a bit of context. So this is from Matthew chapter 16, and this is verse 18 to 19, and it says this. I also say to you that you are Kepha, or Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, or my community of believers, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And here's that term again, and you guys, now you know it. And whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. So this passage, Matthew 16, just to give it a little bit of context, it's a wonderful passage, and it's Yeshua asks his disciples, who do the people say I am? It's a really interesting, and it's kind of odd. He kind of asks them, who do they say I am, or what do they think of me? And it's not like Yeshua needed to know, but he was trying to test and see how deep the revelation of who he was had penetrated the hearts of the people. And Peter, as a disciple, and this is big, this is major, because remember, Peter is Jewish after all, and the number one issue, or the number one commandment for any Jew, is to have no other gods but one. That's the number one commandment, that's the number one issue, that we're a monotheistic people, and we had to have one God and no other gods but him. And so when Peter confesses, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God, that's massive. That's big, because he's saying you are God. He's saying of Yeshua, you are God. And if Yeshua wasn't, that would have been blasphemy. So in this passage, Yeshua asks the disciples and Peter who he is, and then Peter confesses him, you are the Son of God, you are God. And Yeshua goes on to say, blessed are you, Shimon ben Yonah. He said, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not show you this, but my Father who is in the heavens. So he says that actually, for us to recognize and to see who Yeshua is, it's the Father that reveals him to us. You know, it's foolish to think that it's us who bring people in the kingdom, bring people into the kingdom. It's foolish to think that it's us, that it's our work. Actually, we can partner with God, and we can partner with the Holy Spirit into sharing with people. But essentially, it's the Father who reveals who Yeshua is to people. And that's what Yeshua says to him. He said, blessed are you, Simon, that flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. So Peter has this wonderful revelation, and then Yeshua tells him who he is in him. He said, you are Peter, and upon this rock, upon this revelation that you're having, I will build the rest of the community of believers. Upon this revelation that Yeshua is the Son of God revealed to him by the Father, and now I'm going to tell you who you are in me. And that is, upon this rock, I will build the rest of my community. And then he goes on to say, and he uses this phrase, and he says, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. So it's a bit odd, and why would he even say that, and where does that even come from? So we flick to the next slide. So this term of gates, it's actually an ancient and an old Jewish idiom. So we ask, what are the gates of Hades, and what would he be referring to here in the context of this passage? And then the question, once again, we need to ask ourselves is, what would have Yeshua's first century Jewish listeners have understood or been familiar with this phrase or this picture? And once again, they would have been very familiar with it. They would have known that gates in ancient times is where their leaders gathered. So this term for gates, it's actually a really significant one, and it's where the leaders of a city or a town gathered. So if we flick to the next slide, I'm going to read a few verses from the book of Ruth. And I really love the book of Ruth. I think it's a wonderful book. Whenever anyone asks me, like when I used to be a youth leader, and some of the youth would ask me, how do I read my Bible? Where do I start? I'd encourage them to start with the book of Ruth, because I think it's a really beautiful story, and there's a lot in there that stimulates questions. So anyway, so this idiom of gates, it's quite a familiar one, and it's used all throughout the Torah and the Tanakh. And I want to read these few verses for you from the book of Ruth, and just unpack what was going on here and why gates were significant to us in ancient times. So this is from the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verses 1 to 2 and verse 10. So I've not got the whole passage there, just a few verses. So it says this, it says, "Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the gate of his birthplace. And you are witnesses today, all the people who were in the gate," so it literally says all the people who were in the gate, "and the elders said, 'We are witnesses.'" So if you guys are familiar with the book of Ruth, you know Boaz, well, he wasn't the nearest kinsman, but he becomes her kinsman redeemer to redeem her as his wife and to redeem the land and to raise up his relative's name. But in order for this to happen, he has to go to the city gate. And it's a bit strange, it's a bit bizarre going to the city gate to almost transact this land transaction and to ask for Ruth's hand in marriage. So why would you go to the gate? And he goes to the gate because that's where the elders of the town or the city sat. That's where they sat, the elders. Remember, the elders were appointed and elected by the people. They were renowned for their wisdom, for their discernment, for their leadership. And they sat in the city gates. They sat there. And if you had a decision that needed to be made, or direction or guidance, you would go to the city gate and you would meet with the elders of the town. So in the city gates is where the elders sat. If we flick to the next slide, I've got a few more verses here throughout the scriptures, just further qualifying that. So this is from Deuteronomy 25, verse 7. It says this: "But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife," this is if his brother's passed on, "then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate, to the elders, and to say, 'My husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel.'" So this was the commandment. If a brother had been deceased with no children, there was a command there to take his widow as his wife. But it says in the passage there, or it says in the verse, that he needed to go up to the city gate, to the elders, to work this through. So we see here in the Torah that the gate is where the elders sat, once again. Here's another verse, and it's actually, we didn't read it tonight, but when we rise up and bless our women on the Shabbat, we read from this passage. We read from Proverbs 31, talking about Ashit Chayal, a woman of valor. And within that passage, there's this verse here, and it says, her husband is known in the gates, i.e. her husband is an elder, her husband is known for his wisdom when he sits among the elders of the land. So he's renowned, he's someone who sits among the leaders, the elders of the city. So because I read that passage to my wife, that person is referring to me, who sits in the gates among the elders and known for his wisdom. So I often quote that to her, just a reminder. So another reference to being in the gates among the elders. And so there's another verse here from Zechariah where it says this, these are the things which you should do. Speak the truth to one another, judge with truth and judgment for peace in your gates. So once again, you see judgment, decisions being made in the gates among the elders. So we flick to the next slide. So we see here that after Simon Peter's revelation of Yeshua in Matthew 16, given to Simon Peter by the Father, the dialogue that follows, this revelation uses the very familiar Jewish imagery of the gates of Hades. The gates to a village or a city in ancient times, it was a place where all the collective wisdom and governance of the village or city gathered to render decisions and to give advice. So we saw that in Ruth, we saw that when Boaz he goes up to the gate to get a decision from the elders. Can I do this? Do you guys bear witness to this? Do you guys agree with this? We saw in the quote from Zechariah, it says that judgment is in our gates. And if you guys are familiar with Deborah, the prophetess, it talks about war was in the gates amongst the judges, making this decision to go to war. So that you see this over and over again, that elders were in the gates, judges were in the gates, rulers of the city. So governance of the village and city gathered to render decisions and give advice in the form of its elders, its judges, and its leaders. So we see then, why does Yeshua say the gates of Hades? The gates of Hades, in the context of Matthew 16, refers to the collective wisdom and planning of Satan and the forces of darkness proactively looking to scheme against us as followers of Messiah. So I'm going to say that again, the gates of Hades. So the gates, this is where all the wisdom, the collective wisdom and governance and planning was done for every city and every village. The gates of Hades refers to the collective wisdom and planning of Satan and the forces of darkness, proactively looking to scheme against us as followers of Messiah. So in that passage in Matthew 16, Yeshua is saying, on this rock, on this revelation, I'm going to establish my believers. And the plans, the schemes of the wicked one will not overcome you. The gates of Hades isn't this passive sort of just gates standing there. It's this imagery that says that if we know who Yeshua is and if we know who we are in him, that the plans and the schemes of darkness and wickedness will not overwhelm us. The gates of Hades will not prevail on us if we stand on the revelation of who Yeshua is and who we are in him, because that's the revelation that Peter received that day. Okay. So I've kind of come to the end of unpacking these idioms, and I guess what I was trying to demonstrate and trying to get to with you guys is that, we need the scriptures to be a witness to us, to help us grow in maturity. When we think about, if we don't make the effort to understand, to apply ourselves to the scriptures, to study, to unpack, we lose that witness in regards to keeping us on the straight and narrow in our faith. So we need the scriptures, we need to dig deep. And for me, what I wanted to major on today is to encourage you guys that it's worth it. It's worth the effort. And a wonderful starting point is actually simply catching up to our first century Jewish counterparts, catching up to what they would have easily understood because of the historical, cultural, and religious context, 1,000 years of history before Yeshua came into time and space and walked on the planet. And so it's worth humbling ourselves and we need to take off, when we approach the scriptures, we need to take off our 21st century Gentile lenses and put on some first century Jewish ones to give ourselves context and understanding of the scriptures. Because it's for me, when when I understood this and when I began to unpack this, it was wonderful. I couldn't put it down. It was, for me, I was always asking myself, why did he say it like that? Or why did he use that phraseology? I wonder what that audience was thinking. I wonder what they were hearing. I wonder what they would have already understood because of their history, because of our history that God had blessed us with. And so the Jewish advantage spoken about in Romans, it's available to all of us. It's available to all of us. Those first century believers, they had first access to it. They had first access. We can have access to it too. If we humble ourselves and if we apply, if we catch up to what they would have easily understood. And so I just want to encourage you with that we didn't have to go to extra biblical sources or some esoteric speaker or experience to actually just look at some of those phrases and think, where else in the scriptures is that mentioned? Where is that familiar? Where does that come from? Because Yeshua used familiar terms. He wanted his audience to get it, and by extension, us. So it really is exciting, and it really is worth the effort to think, where did that come from? What would they have understood? Where do I go? Where have I heard that before in regards to my reading and my study? So that's kind of me tonight. I wanted to keep it simple, but I hope you guys, were stimulated, and I hope you guys are able to take something away from that. So I think we'll say bye to our online audience. Shabbat Shalom, Laila Tov. And then we'll open up the floor for questions, for questions, observations, devotions, comments.